Gentlemen, and I recognize the gentleman and teacher from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Madam Secretary. Good to see you again. Let's get right to it. Madam Secretary, do you believe that the federal government is legally or constitutionally permitted to punish a private entity for having a different viewpoint than the administration?
What do you mean by that?
Well, does the government have the power, or legally, or is it legal or constitutional for you, the Secretary, to punish a private entity for having a different viewpoint than the administration?
I don't know what you mean by punish. Can you be more specific?
Well, let's move on. Apparently, I don't want to get into this back and forth on this. Let me say, this poster here, you gave an interview on CNBC on May 28th, and discussing the cancellation of Harvard University's federal funding, grants, and contracts. And you said, and I quote, "Universities should continue to be able to do research as long as they're abiding by the laws and in sync, I think, with the administration and what I think the administration is trying to accomplish." So what you're saying, you're saying Harvard can have its funding and its international students back if and when it teaches what the Trump administration demands. These demands are included in this April 11th letter signed by the Department of Education and other agencies, and include a requirement that the government must be able to, quote unquote, audit the viewpoints of its student body, faculty, staff to ensure, quote unquote, viewpoint diversity. I ask unanimous consent to submit this letter for the record.
Without objection, it will be submitted.
And it says, I quote in the letter, quote, "Harvard must abolish all criteria, preferences, and practices through its admissions and hiring practices that function as ideological litmus tests," end quote. Now, Madam Secretary, what are the limits of this viewpoint diversity that the administration is trying to enforce? Under these demands, for example, would the Harvard government department be compelled to hire faculty that believe the 2020 election was stolen?
I believe that there are rights to freedom of speech, but on campuses and universities of colleges and universities across the country, freedom of speech should be allowed. There should be open debate. There should be different viewpoints.
But I'm not asking you a question about freedom of speech here, Madam Secretary. I'm asking you about the limits of viewpoint diversity cited in this letter. You demand that Harvard would be compelled to hire faculty. I mean, well, you're saying that there has to be viewpoint diversity. I'm just asking you, would the government department be compelled to hire faculty that believe the 2020 election was stolen? As an example of viewpoint diversity.
However, one of the things that Harvard crimson, and by its
okay,
own
I think you don't really have an answer, so I'm going to move on to other questions. Maybe we can clarify by other questions. Would viewpoint diversity mean, for example, Madam Secretary, reclaiming my time, Madam Secretary, Different Secretary, would the Harvard Medical School, who is looking to hire an immunologist, would that person need to adhere to HHS Secretary Kennedy's view on the efficacy of vaccines?
Listen, we all know that we should have our universities look at what all the programs are.
I don't think you really thought through this viewpoint diversity issue
that you're trying to put forth is a false narrative.
Okay.
And the funding is a privilege.
Madam Secretary, reclaim my time. Does refusing to hire a Holocaust denier as a member of Harvard's history department faculty count as an ideological litmus test?
I believe that there should be diversity of viewpoints relative to teachings and opinions on campuses.
Well, what about this situation of Harvard's history department, and they're looking for another department member? Would being a Holocaust denier count?
Well, I do know that Harvard did replace its head of Middle Eastern Studies even before we looked at it, because they believed that they needed to make changes already.
Okay, can you explain to me how cutting funding to cutting funding to cancer research, which may save the lives of children, will help Jewish students on campus?
Well, we had to put some teeth in the anti-Semitism studies. So we used, that actually didn't come from the Department of Education, that came from HHS. So therefore, Harvard had indicated
Okay,
that it
well-
might even take from its endowment, which is $53 billion, some funds to continue that research. And I think that might have been a really good use for some of those funds.
Well, I think it's pretty clear you haven't really thought through this whole viewpoint.
Well, you
diversity.
wouldn't know because you haven't allowed me to answer my questions, but thank you.
Well, I think you were showing that you couldn't really answer the questions.
The gentleman's
No.
time has expired.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I